we ought to have some sense, just as you would pay attention more if a natural disaster is headed toward your hometown, because you know that's where I'm from. I have a connection there. We also have that with the Jewish people.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Mike, Russell, and I ask, who are the presidential candidates actually courting? We look at ads, speeches, and other media to figure out an answer. Next, we separate fact from fiction in the recent natural disasters of Hurricanes Helene and Milton with CT's Emily Beltz. Finally, an escalated war between Israel and Iran threatens on the horizon. Find out how Christian theology can help us understand it. Welcome to the show. We're 25 days away from Election Day, and the candidates are making the big push with media to get their faces and agendas before voters. This week, Kamala Harris appeared on the wildly popular Call Her Daddy podcast to talk about abortion rights, and Donald Trump dismissed an invitation to appear on 60 Minutes, breaking more than a half century of tradition with the program where major party candidates for president sit down for a formal interview in October. Ballots are already in the mail. I've already voted, but these next 3 weeks are still vitally important. So I wanted to take some time today to consider ad campaigns and these recent media appearances, and keeping the central question in mind, who are the candidates talking to? As you, Russell, survey the latest media appearances of both candidates, what do you think? Who is important to them right now?
One of the most immediate things is the gender gap that we see in terms of the targeted media, which is sort of an unusual thing in terms of the time of the nation, that we do have such micro-targeted by gender media platforms. So at the same time that Kamala Harris is on Call Her Daddy and various other shows targeted especially toward young women, Trump is on several shows targeted toward young men. And very, very different conversations, very different vibes. Almost in some ways, one would look at even the way the questions are being asked on these different platforms and derive kind of a stereotype of American gender ideas right now. So that's what I think is really unusual. While you also have, it seems to me, Kamala Harris is trying to take on more traditional mainstream media, 60 Minutes, for instance, while also dealing with, she was on The View this week. She was on Howard Stern this week, actually received Howard Stern's endorsement. That's a deviation from the sort of what one would expect with the gender gap, but is
Baba
on,
Booey.
is trying to get all of these different things at once.
Mike, Russell brings up something really interesting that I'd love to talk to you about, because there is a particular kind of intimacy in these conversations on podcasts. And here we sit in front of microphones all the time. But what is so unique about this podcast space? I think about some interviews that JD Vance did in the past that have kind of come back to bite him. Is there a particular aspect to this medium that makes the risks and rewards really significant for the candidates?
I think this medium is fascinating and unique in the way that you can engage the audience and in the way an audience can engage ideas. The first podcast that I actually ever listened to was an episode of Mark Maron's show where he recorded it while driving to a comedy festival with Maria Bamford, one of my favorite comics of all time. And literally, they're driving in the car. They're holding a mic in their hand as he drives, and they have a conversation, an unedited, unscripted conversation for an hour and a half, and that gets released. To me, that's kind of the template. I mean, Ira Glass says that podcasting is a vehicle for empathy, unlike any other, because of the sense of intimacy that gets created, where, especially if they're well recorded, you have this experience of, oh, I'm at the table, I'm listening in. And so there's been smarts to the idea of coming into podcasting for politicians trying to get their message across. One of the best and most interesting interviews that Barack Obama ever did was his appearance on Mark Maron's WTF, a comedy podcast, where he came to it and obeyed the rules of Marin's show. He went to his house, he went to his garage, he put the headphones on, and they sat there and drank coffee. And it created some controversy because it's what podcasts do. In that relaxed environment of two people sitting across the table from each other drinking coffee, where it feels very sort of informal and unfamiliar, Obama spoke candidly in a way that I don't think you can point to another interview where he was quite as candid during his presidency as he was in that one. So I think politicians have learned from that, and there have been other examples of it. Vance, to some extent, is the warning sign about the dangers of that environment. Because Vance goes into those environments and you're sitting around and it's very chummy and it's a bunch of bros, and you find yourself laughing at things and making jokes about things that you might not laugh at or make jokes about otherwise. Donald Trump's appearance this week on the Andrew Schultz podcast was actually very interesting on that front. I think, for one thing, it shows you the brand discipline that Trump has in contrast to Vance, because Trump was very Trump and he was very careful about what he laughed at and what he didn't. Schultz can be a very funny comic, but a very scandalizing comic, and was eager to try to sort of push Trump into uncomfortable places and uncomfortable topics. And Trump didn't take the bait. And yet at the same time, I think that sense of, hey, we just get to listen in on this. This is really cool. I think that was preserved for Schultz's audience. I would also say the same thing about the Alex Cooper, who's the host of the Call Her Daddy podcast that Kamala Harris appeared on. It was interesting to me because Harris has not been great in interviews. We know when she's pressed on policy issues, when there's sort of the high pressure environment of a big media interview, her answers can often come across as like sort of political mad libs. I think she's just uncomfortable in the environment. And in the Call Her Daddy podcast, at no point does she seem uncomfortable. Now, she didn't face tough questions. She wasn't asked about Afghanistan, and she wasn't asked about Joe Biden's mental capacity and what she knew and when or anything like that. But they weren't softballs either. They were policy questions that were very directed at Alex Cooper's audience, which is women's issues, reproductive rights, etc. And I think if you listen to it, you go, well, this is probably a lot more accurate to kind of who Kamala Harris is in the room, what she's about, what really matters to her, why this issue is front and center for her, as well as issues like domestic abuse and things like that that came up in the conversation. I was surprised by it in that sense, because I do think she has struggled a lot in some of her more formal interviews.
I have said for some time, and I shock myself every time I say it because I can't believe I'm saying it, but I think Howard Stern might be one of the best interviewers alive today. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that he's not part of the guild. And I think that's true with a lot of these podcasters. They're not going to be facing the why didn't you ask about whatever, or why didn't you do it this way? They're simply asking the things that they're curious about. It sort of reminds me of preaching. There's a real difference between preachers you can tell are preaching for other preachers and preachers who are talking to the people in front of them. And I think there's some of that dynamic with some of these interviews as well. I mean, I think of Stern did an interview with Hillary Clinton after the 2016 election that was the most open and vulnerable interview with her I have ever heard. And you think about somebody who's very evasive, holds things close to the vest. He was able to get her to talk about what it was like to date Bill Clinton and what it was like to lose to Donald Trump, and all those kinds of things. I think there's something about not having the pressure of the guild.
Russell, when you think about Donald Trump dismissing the 60 Minutes interview this week, back to our question at the top of the show of who are the candidates talking to, does he know that he's talking to people's hearts instead of their heads, that they really aren't interested in the kind of substantive conversations that maybe we have come to expect over almost half a century in these 60-minute interviews?
I think he's leaning into his theory of the case, which is to say that the way he thinks he's going to win is not by expanding the electorate and persuading suburban women and others. The way that he thinks he's going to be elected is if there's a lower turnout from kind of normie voters, lower turnout with suburban educated voters, and that he really mashes the gas when it comes to his constituency. of mostly non-college educated younger males. That's what he's looking for. So, we really won't know whether that works for him or not until November the 5th. It did in 2016, but remember, it did mostly because that last month of the 2016 campaign, Trump kind of went quiet. People could almost forget some of what they had seen. It'll be interesting to see whether that happens this time. The danger for him is that it feeds into this fear of debating. I mean, he's refused even a Fox debate now with Kamala Harris. And so the question is, does that cause people to say he's not even willing to show up or not? I don't know. I mean, we may be in such a different American life right now that there's almost nothing that matters to anybody.
What about these other segments of voters? I'm thinking here of Latinos in Pennsylvania who have been a significant focus for both of the candidates. I mean, everybody's trying to get Bad Bunny to endorse them for president right now. 53% of the Latino population in Pennsylvania is Puerto Rican, and both of the candidates have appeared with actors and Puerto Rican musicians. Do you think that any of these gestures have any kind of lasting impact? Or are they just these flash in the pan kind of celebrity pairings?
Well, it doesn't work when Trump receives the endorsement of a rapper by calling him her and
Ouch.
saying
Yeah.
that she's hot. I mean, that didn't take. but other than that, I think it does at the margins, and that's where the election is going to be won because it's not so much about, well, Taylor Swift is for Kamala Harris, therefore I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris or whatever. It's a reminder and a nudge to people go take the time to vote. And every little bit of that happens has some effect.
One of the lessons that we're going to see on the backside of this election is that the Latino vote is not a monolith at all. My encounters with Latino voters, I would say country of origin and class are the primary defining characteristics as far as who they're going to vote for. Most of the Latinos that I'm friends with and that I've spoken with about this are very, very, very pro Trump. And they're surprisingly pro Trump in part because of the border. They see open borders as actually bad for them, bad for their families and their kids, and the hostility that's been created around open borders as being a net negative for them and their families. And so I think it'll be interesting to see. And I mean, it's a cliche to say it's all about turnout, but it really is all about you have two candidates that are still generally unpopular, not quite in the situation we were in with Joe Biden a couple of months ago, but two candidates who are generally unpopular. Who's going to be able to get enough motivation about the negative polarization? What happens if the other guy wins? That's probably going to drive more people to the polls than anything else.
Most of our listeners have probably decided who they want to vote for if they care to vote at all this year. And yet we all have to live in this media environment. Russell, where can we find relief? Where can we find a sense of calling or a guiding light when there's so much noise that surrounds us in this campaign season?
Well, I mean, we really don't have to all live in this media environment. That's what's so different about this time. There was a time when, if you're listening to the radio or watching television, you're going to be exposed to all of these ads. We're now at a time where things are so tailored to you that there are certain people who can say, oh, all I see and all I hear are Kamala Harris ads or Donald Trump ads. And then other people who never see anything like that at all. For most people who are at this point, we know what we're going to do. We're decided. We know kind of how we feel. I've known how I feel about these candidates since Home Alone 2. And so there's not going to be any sort of revelation that's going to change any of our minds here. For most people, it probably is good, especially if you're being sort of made anxious by all of this, to find media outlets that are going to kind of cut you off. I mean, I listen to a lot of sort of political podcasts and those sorts of things. I find myself listening to a lot more Office Ladies reruns these days and things like that, where it's like, okay, I'm just going to shut my brain off from this for a little while. I think for some people, that's the thing to do.
I think another aspect of that too is to make deliberate choices about limiting your media diet. Make decisions, decide, hey, here's some voices that I really like, and they seem thoughtful. And when they speak, I find myself resonating, or I find myself challenged in healthy ways where they're being sober, they're offering a complicating perspective, but then sort of narrowing to say, I'm going to subscribe to what these people are doing. I'm going to see what they're writing and kind of dial in and read that stuff. What I'm going to stay out of, and this is something that even I've had to do more and more over the last few months, is I want to stay out of the constant churn of bile on social media around these things, where every political decision is moralized and absolutized, and your faith becomes dependent upon which box you check on election day.
It's easy to become confused by the data that pours in the last month of a campaign, when reality, seeing what is happening is not really dependent upon this Quinnipiac poll as opposed to this other poll. That's not how you see it. I mean, in 2016, my mind told me that Hillary Clinton was going to win. My gut told me that Donald Trump was going to win the entire election through, and there was a conflict. This year, it's the reverse. My mind says Donald Trump probably has the ability to pull this off. My gut tells me Kamala Harris is going to win. We'll see. But I mean, the biggest indicator for me in 2016 as to where this was going to go had nothing to do with polling. It had to do with the last couple days. Hillary Clinton changes her schedule, and Barack and Michelle Obama change their schedule to be in Pennsylvania and Michigan at the last minute. That tells me there's internal polling, which is a lot better and more reliable than the polling that news networks and others do. Something's really going on here. So you're going to get confused if you're just sort of taking in the minute by minute stuff anyway.
If your mind gut connection is starting to give you indigestion, it may be time to turn off the media and enjoy a little bit of silence. We will be right back. Last Thursday night, Hurricane Helene made landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast, hurrying up the eastern seaboard, leaving devastation in its wake. And we are recording this on Thursday, and last night, Hurricane Milton made landfall in Florida, rising to a Category 5 hurricane and what was estimated to be the strongest hurricane so far this season. In the last week, lots of misinformation has been swirling around news about the hurricanes and their destruction, including rumors that FEMA had been stealing donations and diverting disaster aid to Ukraine. And in some cases, one wonders if these rumors ripping apart the fabric of communities have actually been more destructive in some ways than the storms themselves. Joining us to talk about the hurricanes is CT staff writer Emily Bells, who has been covering the disaster for our magazine. Emily, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Clarissa.
Emily, you've got family and friends who are in these hardest hit regions. Can you give us sort of a sensory tour of the area right now? What does it sound like and smell like and look like and feel like there?
Yeah, I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, which is one of the hardest hit areas. And it's really surreal. It's sort of like your hometown got bombed overnight. I mean, it's not a place that you expect to have hurricanes. And so I don't think anyone was prepared for that level of devastation. I talked to a pastor in Swananoa, which is a neighborhood that's basically wiped off the map. And he was saying he has people who are dehydrated. I mean, it's sort of like a war zone in a way. The roads are wiped out in a lot of places, so it's very difficult to bring supplies in to rebuild the infrastructure. It compounds the issue when there's no cell service, which is still a case in a lot of places. There's no running water. I was talking to someone who was in touch with a homeless shelter in Asheville, and it's 120 people. You think about like, oh, you could just drive to another area that has running water, but they can't. And so there's women who are pregnant who don't have running water, who don't have a nearby hospital with running water, things like that. So there is that segment of the population that I think is stuck, and it just makes the response effort complicated when you're trying to deal with so many problems all at once.
Russell, you grew up in prime hurricane territory. How long does it take for folks to return and really rebuild after something like this? Not just the infrastructure, but their lives.
Well, with a huge hurricane, as we've seen in both of these instances, after Katrina, it took us a full 10 years for things to be in any way back to kind of familiar. And even then, I think one of the things that lingers is the psychological sense of impending doom that a lot of people have, along with this. Emily mentioned it's almost like having your hometown bombed out of existence is exactly what I thought when we were able to get back to Biloxi after Katrina, and just driving down a place I could drive with my eyes closed and not knowing where I was is a vertigo-inducing sort of thing, and so it takes a long time of looking at certain landmarks that you always assumed were going to be there that are now gone, and wondering what's going to happen next. So there were a lot of people. I mean, I know people who both of my grandmother's houses were completely wiped out by Katrina. And as they were even thinking about rebuilding, there was a sense of, well, what's the point? Because how do we know something's not going to come along later and wipe it out? So there's in some ways, a healthy kind of understanding of the precariousness and fragility of life, sort of build upon the rock, Jesus' teaching metaphor. But then there's an undue, I think, kind of anxiety that lingers for a long time, and that's one of the worst aspects of it. In all of these communities, it does remind us of the fact of how interdependent we actually are. So you have people who are very accustomed to kind of being on their own, they can do whatever they need to do, and in those moments, they really do need. So you will have people who will say, "We don't need the government involved in our lives." They really do need FEMA in those moments. And you have people who will say, "We don't need the churches. Why is religion getting involved in anything?" They really need Samaritan's Purse and the Salvation Army and others in those moments. So it kind of reveals our illusions of independence too.
There have been so many rumors that have been swirling around, Helene in particular, and they sort of fall into these 4 buckets. The rumors about funding, FEMA doesn't have enough funding, it's diverting funding to pay for conflicts overseas. Then we've got these rumors about care, like they're confiscating donations, they're discriminating against certain populations. We've got rumors about access, that they're blocking people who are trying to flee or blocking aid from arriving. And then you have these ones that feel really extreme, like politicians manipulating the weather to target Republican areas, and the government is trying to seize land to mine lithium. Mike, we know that fear runs high, as Russell has said. There's a normal and a natural fear, but what is fueling this that feels like it's next level?
I thought it was really telling a day or so ago when Representative Chuck Edwards, who represents this area, had to put out a press release debunking some of these things. And the second point in his series of statements is nobody can control the weather. The fact that we have to have members of Congress saying this to their constituents to warn them off of all these like bizarre reports where these rumors were swirling online that, hey, this was all about it's a red state, so Democrats are seeding the clouds and making the storm worse so that these people can't get to the polls and vote for Donald Trump. It's nuts. It's wild. And I think part of what's grotesque about this is that people are seeing this not as a moment for the country to come together and say, we're all Americans and we want to help everyone we can and we want to thrive and flourish as a country. They're saying, let's not even wait until the floodwaters recede and the dust settles. Let's dive in right now to make this a partisan issue, to blame the other side, and to further polarize and activate our side to show up and vote against them. This is about power. It's not about concern for the truth. It's not even about a concern for the experience of these fellow citizens that are actually suffering. They care about animating people all around the country to show up and vote against somebody that they don't like or that they can demonize through this kind of false statement.
Who is spreading these rumors?
It's largely been a right-wing thing. This is not unique entirely to the right-wing thing. I mean, everybody remembers back during Katrina, Kanye West coming on television to say that George W. Bush doesn't care about black people, and that's why the Katrina disaster was as bad as it was. It wasn't that the infrastructure was decayed and the storm was terrible. And it was a potent mix of things that created such a disaster. And people mocked Kanye for that, but also that narrative had legs for George W. Bush for a long time. This is very much a right-wing thing now because you've got Democrats in power and you've got the kind of paranoia that says we don't believe in climate change, which is making hurricanes worse and worse and worse. And hey, look, we can debate about the reasons for climate change and all the rest of it. But the fact is, hurricanes and big storms are getting worse and worse and worse year over year. We don't believe in climate change. So, what's the most logical thing? It's that the Democrats are controlling the weather. And of course, there's like old school anti Semitic tropes around this too, that the Jews are controlling the weather. And there's plenty of versions of that that are floating around the internet as well.
I know one person who can control the weather, and he is Jewish, so
Yeah.
maybe there's a link.
Congress's most infamous anti-Semite, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she was one of the first ones to come out and push this stuff. And when you're a little removed from those circles, you see MTG say something like that, and you go, "Oh, good grief!" But she is a credible source of information for a very large chunk of the American public, and people take that seriously, and they say, "Well, here's a representative of Congress saying they control the weather. Clearly, that must be behind why this storm is so bad and people are so devastated."
And I had that just on a personal level with, like you said, it's spread to the public where people were texting me some of this kind of misinformation. And I'm hearing from my family that's living through this the opposite, that the National Guard was right there saving people, that all the supplies were arriving, that kind of thing. I'm a reporter who covers difficult things happening all the time in our country. And it's been very discouraging to see covering the East Palestine train crash, covering the Springfield thing more recently, where this misinformation was endangering people's lives, that this has become kind of a feature of whenever difficult things happen, this is how our nation copes with it. It's almost like, to me, it feels like a sport where people see something terrible happen and it's a chance to score points one way or the other. I don't know how we continue as a society to respond well to difficult suffering if we can't be truthful about it. But I think the encouraging part of covering these hurricanes is seeing how the church is being the church and helping people without, I think it helped in North Carolina that cell phone service was out, so they didn't hear a lot of these rumors, but they were busy on the ground doing disaster relief and helping people escape from mudslides and things like that.
So, in various other natural disasters, we have seen religious figures stand up and interpret these in spiritual terms. And Russell, you noted in a piece for CT this week that when we bring God into the equation, we may even have bigger questions and bigger fears than whether FEMA is showing up or not. And this feels like almost a situation of Job and his friends. What did he do to deserve this? And Job's friends are so quick to explain his suffering away. When you think about this disaster now, what does it tell us about God when human beings have their entire lives just wiped away?
It tells us what the book of Job tells us about God, which is not a set of data points as to why something happens. Instead, the end result is I put my hand over my mouth. There's a sense of Romans 8. We're groaning at the wreckage of creation around us, at the devastation and death that is all around us, and we're crying out, Abba, Father. And we subvert all of that when we come in and try to act like Job's friends and say, well, you've undergone this tragedy because you. Regardless of whether what you're trying to say is it's because you are so bad that God is punishing you, which Jesus completely repudiates in multiple examples. Or when we say this has happened to you because there's some shadowy conspiracy controlling everything around you, rather than realizing we are living in a world that is screaming, Paul says in Romans, for all things to be made new, for all things to be made right. When we try to find all of the answers, that really prevents us from doing what Emily was just talking about right now, getting there and being there and doing what it is that God is calling us to do to love people.
In what ways, Emily, do you see the churches in these areas conveying that message?
Churches are already planted, every few blocks in a community. So they became the natural gathering points for a lot of communities. Even I interviewed this pastor who said that they had been looking for ways to get more involved in their community. And then this happened. And the distribution point for people to survive, to get water, to get food. And so I think that it boils things down for a church. They're meeting outside and praying together for church services because they don't have buildings anymore. And I think the big national disaster Christian relief organizations that have come in are all partnering with those churches. So I think the churches provide this really important network in an area that's been devastated that these Christian organizations like Samaritan's Purse can latch onto and maybe respond better than even the local government in some ways because they have this deep community network. So it's been encouraging to see the amount of dependence, I guess, that the community sees with the churches, that it matters that the churches are there. It wouldn't be functioning the way that it is in these places without some of these congregations. And I think that's renewed their faith and renewed relationships in the community, not to romanticize a bad situation, but I think the people I've interviewed have said that it's been pretty transformative.
And after every natural disaster I can think of in this country over the last 25 years, North Carolina Baptists have been there immediately for everybody, whether it's in Florida, it's in my hometown, it's other places. And so and now here they are also just working and plowing away through and caring for people in their own state.
Yeah, I talked to the head of North Carolina Baptist, and he said that they're providing 140,000 hot meals a day in the Western North Carolina area. That is an astronomical number. I'm not sure if anybody can compete with that.
Emily, you wrote this piece for CT that talks about a Taiwanese group sending aid. And I wanted to end here because, in all of the rumor mill, there is this redemptive dimension here of these unlikely companions showing up to do really good things. Can you tell us the story of this Taiwanese group?
Yeah, so as you may know, Taiwan experiences typhoons, and World Vision Taiwan had been watching the situation in Western North Carolina. I doubt that anyone in Western North Carolina knew that Taiwanese Christians were paying attention to them. But when they saw that there had been no running water, that water supply was cut off for perhaps months to come, they asked if they could help. And World Vision US facilitated the delivery of one of their water systems from Taiwan that they had used during a typhoon to Western North Carolina. So that was installed yesterday at a homeless shelter in Western North Carolina. And that is, I think, even regardless of the water, I think just the act of love from so far away is something that was really meaningful to the people in Western North Carolina.
That's good to hear. Emily, thank you so much for joining us. We will be right back. Since Iran unleashed a barrage of missiles on Israel last week, the second time it has done so in 6 months, the world has waited in anticipation to see how Israel will respond. Diplomatic talks this week between the US and Israel and Iran and its Arab neighbors highlight that there are complexities in this region that offer no easy fixes. Now, as we're still waiting to see what happens next, I wanted to take a pause in this episode to dig a little bit deeper beneath the current conflict to help us better understand the spiritual history of the region and how Christians can distinctively approach what's happening and what will be happening here in the next few weeks. Russell, there are conflicts all over the world all the time, and there have been for ages. Why do the world's eyes always seem to be drawn back to what's happening in Israel? Why does it command our attention?
Well, partly because there are a group of nations who are intent upon destroying Israel. You have a small nation surrounded by people who don't want them to exist. And then you add to it those other realities. I mean, Iran, for instance, has been a trouble in the region going all the way back to the 1970s, specifically for the United States. And now on the cusp of nuclear capability, that brings with it all kinds of other concerns. And then you add to it, it's not just that you have an Iran Israel sort of trouble as though it's Muslim Jewish problems only. Saudi Arabia and Iran are at each other's throats and have been for a long time. So it complicates the whole storyline. With Iran, you have a country that is ruled by ayatollahs, ideologically unhinged, have been shown to be willing to do all kinds of things not in the interest of their own people. And that's what makes this also especially precarious right now.
Mike, one Israeli senior intelligence officer told the New York Times this week that Israel has developed what he called an increased tolerance for short term danger in order to achieve long term security. And as I read that phrase, I wondered, is this sort of the essence of the Jewish story?
That's an interesting question. I think in terms of what he's referring to for sure is so much of the posture that Israel has had really over the last 20 years, and certainly since 2014, has been a minimal layer of deterrence. We're not going to go into Lebanon. We're not going to go into Gaza. We're going to minimize our engagement with the West Bank. And we're going to hope that by policing our borders really well, by relying on these defensive weapons that they have, like Iron Dome and David Sling, we can sort of maintain and prosper. People used to refer to this as mowing the lawn. It just became this maintenance mode of taking care of their defense. Where I think they are now is there's a recognition that it's been a solid year of rockets being fired at them from Lebanon. And this is a year, on the heels of October the 7th. I think what that refers to is a sense that we would rather take the risk of going into Lebanon and pushing Hezbollah back to a line on the map, which, by the way, was agreed upon by the UN and a number of international parties and never enforced. We'd rather take the risk there. We'd rather take the risk of striking inside Iran and striking back at Iran. And we'd rather take the risk of trying to truly cripple Hamas and take it down in Gaza to create a different sense of deterrence. Deterrence prior to October the 7th was, we know how to defend ourselves when you send rockets and terrorists our way. Deterrence now is, if you send rockets and terrorists our way, you will pay a price for it. And what Israel has to do is raise the price high enough that its neighbors say, okay, we got to think about this differently.
Is this a mindset that Israel has had for more than 100 years?
Well, certainly since the founding of Israel. I mean, so much of what the, sort of the language of never again after the Holocaust is tied to that. If you go back and you read 19th century Zionists who were making this case for a Jewish state, it's kind of a fascinating thing. The whole notion, if you go back to Herzl, for instance, Herzl's whole notion was, look, you've got nationalism on the rise all around Europe. People want to embrace their national identity and defend themselves and defend their neighbors and have a sense of solidarity. And Jews, we've lived as a diaspora. We've lived sort of homeless among the nations in these various ways. He was not making a religious case for the return to the homeland. He was making a case for nationalism and self-defense. We need a place that's our own where we can defend ourselves from our attacks. Why not go back to our ancient homeland in Israel while we're at it? And interestingly, the response of much of the religious Jewish world was, well, we really can't go back to Israel until the Messiah comes and takes us back. That's what we're actually waiting on. Well, after the Holocaust, that changed, because after the Holocaust, these religious Jews around the world said, we really can't see a restoration of Israel in throne and crown and all the rest of that until the Messiah comes. But while we're waiting, maybe we should wait in our ancient homeland where we can still bond together and defend ourselves. Again, I think what we've seen in the last year has been a shift from a posture that said, we're going to rely on our technology and our intelligence services and our allies to keep us safe from the threats that are literally at our front door, to saying, we can't rely on those allies. We can't rely on those services. We actually have to, when someone knocks on our front door and says, we want to wipe you out from the river to the sea, we have to take that seriously. and eliminate that threat in order to protect our citizens, to keep our covenant with our citizens that says that they can live here and build homes and be safe in the world.
I'm a sort of theological mutt. I grew up in a dispensational tradition, spent my early adulthood in an Anabaptist congregation before landing squarely in a covenant theology tradition. And every church I attended believed something different about Israel. And some friends I know who go to non denominational churches, nobody ever talks about Israel unless it's sort of just the setting for the Old Testament and the New Testament. Russell, how much does it actually matter what a person's church believes about Israel when we're talking about these headlines and being able to interpret what's going on?
I also grew up in a dispensationalist church that was very emphatic about the restoration of Israel as a nation in 1948 was the beginning of the fig tree blossoming, and the 40 years of this generation will not pass away, that sort of thing, and all the Bible prophecy movements. I don't hold to that theology anymore and haven't for a long, long time. What I've found, though, is that often you have people who overreact to whatever bad theology they've received about Israel. There is a kind of theology of Israel that bypasses Jesus, bypasses the way that the New Testament finds the fulfillment of the covenant relationship with Israel in Jesus Christ. And all of those who are in him now are sons and daughters of Abraham and therefore heirs according to promise. Sometimes people overreact to that by saying, well, that means that Israel is bad. And in reality, no matter what theological tradition one might be in Christianity, we are rooted in Jewishness. We are rooted in Abraham. Salvation comes to the Jew first and also to the Greek, Paul says. And that doesn't mean that God has cast away the Jewish people, Romans 11. So we ought to have some sense, just as you would pay attention more if a natural disaster is headed toward your hometown, because you know that's where I'm from. I have a connection there. We also have that with the Jewish people. And then you look at that in terms of just a democracy in the middle of a nation of autocratic, repressive states. You come to certain conclusions about that too. That doesn't mean, though, as some Christians have done, well, whatever Israel does then is right, because those that bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse. Again, bypassing Jesus, where that Galatians 3, where that falls. One could be able to say, as I do, Israel is a democratic state, an ally of the United States, that we should support, and can and does make mistakes. No Benjamin Netanyahu poster on my wall. So you have a complex view then of the way nation states can be supported and loved, and also can often be mistaken and can be wrong and should be criticized when they are, just as we do the United States of America.
Mike, do you think we have a similar problem when it comes to understanding Islam? 97% of Iranians are Muslim. Is there just so much we don't understand about Islam that ignorance sort of informs our responses to the headlines?
I think that's definitely true. And I think some of it is well intended. There was a very real danger in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11 to demonize Islam as uniquely evil, a unique threat to American life and the Western world. And in that, what often happened is people failed to distinguish between the kinds of westernized Islam that, let's say, we're trying to build a cultural center in Manhattan near Ground Zero, and the kinds of Islam that exist in the halls of the mullahs in Iran, or that are driving organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. And so there was, as a result of compassion for westernized Islam, westernized Muslims who were being unfairly targeted and persecuted post 9/11 and during the war on terror, there became this sort of blanket reaction to say, well, we can't say anything negative about Islam, period, anywhere else in the world. The reality is the Islam that dominates the Middle East, and particularly that dominates a place like Iran and dominates its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah, this is an Islam that, if a young woman doesn't properly cover her hair, she gets beaten to death by the purity police. If someone is discovered to be gay, they are hung from a crane in the center of town. This is a brutal fundamentalist regime whose hatred of Jews is a religiously motivated, ideological hatred of Jews. I think we also underestimate the extent to which the ambitions of Iran and the way Islam informs the ambitions of Iran are part of this larger century and a half long story that really kind of began with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There's a shame culture element to this. And what Israel represents, in a certain sense, is it's this beacon of quote unquote success by the West, which is an offense to Islamic imperial ambitions that drive Iran, that drive Hezbollah, that drive certain other powers. I mean, the Saudi Arabia story is absolutely fascinating because they've embraced a more westernized kind of Islam. They're still a brutal regime. They're still brutal with their people. They're still brutal in terms of the way that they punish people. But they recognize that they live in a world in which they've got to figure out how to make peace with their non Islamic neighbors in order to thrive and flourish economically and culturally and everything else. Iran has no interest in that. Iran's ambitions are military, they're for dominance. It's literally messianic. It's literally an expectation that forget the river to the sea. It's from the sea to the sea to the sea to the sea. Islam is going to cover the earth. And if it takes military power and nuclear weapons to get them there, that's the ambition. I think the mistake we make so often in the West is when we talk about Iran and we talk about these proxies in the Middle East, we talk about let's get to the negotiating table, let's make a deal. And we think of them like Western Muslims who have political grievances that are reasonable and we can talk about, rather than looking at them as an imperial totalitarian state with global domination ambitions. So long as we keep framing them in these ways that are much more friendly and neighborly, we're going to keep finding ourselves in a position where we're surprised by, oh man, that hostage deal fell through as well. It happens over and over and over again.
There can be a misunderstanding in that direction. There also can be a misunderstanding in recognizing that the Iranian people are not necessarily content with the kind of autocratic leadership that they have. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I'm convinced of, with no evidence, but I'm convinced of this, that in my lifetime I will see a free Iran and that the grip of the mullahs and the ayatollahs will be gone. And if that's the case, I think one of the things going to be shocking to people are how many Christians there are now in Iran who were not there previously, with a very, very strong underground presence there. As somebody who was a kid during the Iranian hostage crisis, one of my hopes right now is I think about Jimmy Carter saying, I want to outlive the last guinea worm. And it looks like he did. I'd like to see Jimmy Carter outlive the Iranian regime.
I think the other thing people will be shocked by is the speed with which Iran makes peace with Israel when the mullahs are thrown
Yeah.
out.
Hmm.
Because this is, again, like culturally, there's a lot that's very modern and westernized about Iran. It is an oppressed people, oppressed by a totalitarian regime that they hate, but who manages that oppression because they run these oil fields and they have these weapons factories that are enriching them because they're selling weapons to Russia and to China and making a fortune on it that just continues to sort of empower this military regime that dominates the country. Topple that regime and the Iranian people come back with the same kinds of values that I think we saw them embracing in the 1970s. You're going to see a very different Iran very, very quickly. And I think the speed with which they make peace with Israel will make your head spin.
So, kind of looping back to the beginning of our conversation, should what we believe about Israel or Iran as Christians shape our foreign policy here in the US? Or as a pluralistic society, should we be using a different weighing mechanism? And if so, what would that be?
I've spent years following this story for various reasons. And I was a pastor for many years. I've been very interested in eschatology and thinking about theology and all of this. And I really do find myself, I mean, my running joke for this is that I believe in eschatology because I'm kind of like, I don't know, right? I don't know exactly what is God's plan for Israel and what do we do about 1,000 years this and 1,000 that. And full disclosure, I mean, my leanings are not at all towards dispensational theology and a hyper literal reading of the book of Revelations. However, I do think there is something profound about the fact that I believe it was Walker Percy who said it, that you can't walk down the streets of the average city in the world today and bump into an Assyrian or a Babylonian.
Hittite.
But
Yeah.
you can find, or a Hittite, but you can find a Jew, a member of this 4,000-year-old tribe that has somehow been preserved in history and preserved their sense of identity, preserved their practices and their beliefs. There is something kind of miraculous about the reemergence of this country 2 millennia after it was destroyed. There is something kind of miraculous about Israel winning the 48 war and the 67 war and coming out on top of the Yom Kippur War. This little island of 7 million Jews surrounded by nations of, I don't even know the number, it's tens and tens of millions of Arab Muslim nations, most of whom have at one point or another pledged their destruction. The idea that God's not in that just strikes me as a stretch. How that works out on paper, I defer to others to try to figure that out. There's something in this that I think ought to sort of humble us as we try to discern it. But that also doesn't mean, as Russ already said, that doesn't mean that you then sit there and say, well, they get to do whatever they want. I think God was very critical of the nation of Israel throughout the Hebrew Bible. So I think calling them to live up to the standards of human dignity that are inherent in Judeo-Christian theology, that remains a priority, I believe.
The current state of Israel could break up the way that the old Yugoslavia did, and it would not affect me theologically at all in terms of what I believe. It would affect me as a world citizen and as an American. But regardless of what one thinks about sort of, is there any kind of prophetic placing of the current state of Israel, what we all know is that, as Paul says, we have been grafted onto a Jewish branch. And so, whatever we think about Israeli politics, we can't be the people who don't recognize what's going on with anti Semitism. And to see the fact that that is persistent throughout history. The reason why we have a state of Israel right now is because there was a genocidal attempt to wipe Jews off the face of the earth. That has to matter to us as Christians. And we're included in this project that God started with an uncircumcised Gentile who became the father of the Jewish people, Abram to Abraham. That's our story now, too. So we have to care about that.
Listeners, don't scurry away just yet. We want to hear from you. Email us at podcasts@christianitytoday.com to tell us which segment you liked best this week and why. We'll randomly pick a winner and announce your name next week on Friday's show and send you some fun Bulletin swag. Thanks for listening to the show. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.